So what happened when Jesus died? Shortly after his death, we take a look at what happened, and those historical scholars we've already referred to, in general, agree with three facts that are considered relatively incontrovertible. And I'm giving you what's called the minimal facts argument, if you want to look into this. It's called the minimal facts argument, primarily promoted by a man named Gary Habermas, who's written a book called The Historical Jesus. Also by his protege, Michael Licona, who's written a book called The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. He wrote it alongside Gary Habermas. And he's also written his manifesto, a rather large book that serves well for curing insomnia. He's written that as well. Sorry, Mike. He's written that as well. And if you want to look at a very thorough investigation of the historical method on whether or not Jesus died, I suggest you take a look at this book published by Erdman's. Michael Licona is the author. Every scholar who studies this, at least a vast majority, if not virtually all scholars, conclude three things happened after Jesus died. Well, number one, the first one is that Jesus did die on the cross, which we just looked at. Number two, that the disciples, Jesus' disciples, all believed he had risen from the dead. Now get me right here. That doesn't mean he did just because they believed it, but it means they did sincerely believe it. They went to their death believing Jesus died and rose and appeared to them. So it's that belief that we're holding on to. Not necessarily that he did, but they sincerely believed he had risen from the dead. And why do they conclude that, by the way? All the disciples ran away from Jesus when he was arrested. They were fearful. They didn't know what was going on. Even Thomas, who was willing to go to his death for Jesus, when Jesus was arrested, they all ran away. Of course, we know John watched the crucifixion, and we do know that Peter came to the trial scene, but at least at that time, they all ran away. However, after the resurrection, these men were willing to go to their deaths proclaiming that Jesus had risen from the dead. These men were willing to die for the fact that this man had risen. Again, that doesn't mean he had actually risen, that we're not there yet. But it does mean they sincerely believed it, because liars make poor martyrs. People aren't going to die for a lie or something that they know is false. Of course, people die for things that are false all the time, but not things that they know are false. So, the disciples truly believed that Jesus had risen from the dead, and according to most historical Jesus scholarship, Christianity wouldn't have gotten off the ground if it weren't for that fact. Fact number three. Fact number one was Jesus died on the cross. Fact number two, the disciples truly believed he had risen from the dead. Fact number three, people who were enemies of Jesus, or not his disciples, also believed he had risen from the dead. Now, who are we talking about? We're talking specifically about two people, James, the brother of Jesus, and Paul, or Saul of Tarsus, as it were. James, the brother of Jesus, did not follow Jesus during his lifetime. We see in the book of Mark that Jesus' family comes up and says to people around Jesus that he is out of his mind, basically, that he's crazy, which is what leads Jesus to say, "Who is my mother and brother and sister?" It's those who do the will of God. So Jesus' family is not on his side. It wasn't until after the resurrection, or supposedly the resurrection, when all of a sudden the disciple James becomes the brother of Jesus, James, becomes a leader of the Christian church. And also Saul of Tarsus. Who is this Saul guy? Saul was the student of Gamaliel, one of the chief leaders of the Jews in the time. This man was primed and groomed to be a leader of Jews, a leader of Pharisees. He was going to have all kinds of power in the temple. He already had all kinds of power because he was able to deliver people to prison. He was given special permission to hunt Christians down. Yet this man was willing to go to his death over and over and over again. For something. For what? He claims it was because he has seen the risen Jesus. Now, let's stop and think for just a second. We've got these three facts that, again, virtually every scholar agrees with who studies the historical Jesus. How do we account for these three facts? Well, let's put the resurrection aside for a bit. What is the most common alternative hypothesis for the resurrection of Jesus? Number one, it's that the disciples hallucinated Jesus. They hallucinated his return. And the argument goes as follows. People who have followed a man like Jesus, their spiritual leader, for years and years and years, they've grown to love him. Of course we can expect them to see the risen Jesus after he dies. They hallucinated him. They loved him so much he returned to them, at least in their eyes. And we know that people today, and this part is true, we know that people today often see their loved ones after they died. That must have happened with Jesus' disciples. They saw Jesus after he died. Okay, let's take a look at that hypothesis for just a minute. The earliest records of Jesus' resurrection say that 500 people saw him risen at the same time. Now, what am I talking about? I'm going to explain this briefly because I want you to have the evidence before you so you know what we're talking about. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 through 8. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 through 8. Yes, they're written by Paul. And Paul wrote 1 Corinthians probably towards the end of the 40s AD or the beginning of the 50s AD. But here's what a group of, when I say non-Christian, I mean non-Orthodox Christian scholars have claimed. This is the Jesus Seminar. Many of these people call themselves atheists and agnostics. None of them is really a friend to traditional Christianity. Here's what they argue. 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 8, comes from a formulation that arose 2 to 5 years after Jesus' death. 2 to 5 years after Jesus' death. Stop and think for just a moment. What from all of history comes that quickly? The first biography of Alexander the Great that we consider substantial comes 300 to 400 years after Alexander died. 300 to 400 years after Alexander died. This is 2 to 5 years after Jesus' death. Nothing in history comes that fast. In fact, one scholar who's even more respected than many of the Jesus Seminar scholars is a man by the name of James D.G. Dunn. And in his book, Jesus Remembered, James D.G. Dunn is a professor emeritus out of Durham University in the UK. In his book, Jesus Remembered, he says that this formulation came within months after Jesus' death. So he dies at the Passover before the end of the year. People have already formulated the fact that Jesus rose from the dead and appeared to Peter and James and the 12, and then to the 500. All of that is formulated within months after Jesus' death. This is history at its finest. So, what is the claim that I'm making? Is it historically certain that Jesus rose from the dead? That's not the claim I'm making. The claim I'm making is that Jesus' resurrection is historically the most responsible claim. It is by far the one that fits the facts the best. That's my